So now we're going to talk about eating disorders before we get on to nutrition and exercise, because there are some things that you need to know about eating disorders and exercise, as well as diet. And I thought it was really important because college age students are at increased risk for eating disorders. So at least 15% of young women in the US not diagnosed with eating disorders have disordered eating attitudes and behavior. If you look at the cause of eating disorders, there is a genetic component, and there's a neurochemical component that is brain chemistry. There's a sociocultural component that is very evident, and a psychosocial component as well. We'll talk about all of those. So one of the ways I like to look at eating disorders, the development of an eating disorder, is three factors. One is there's some predisposing factors. There's certain personality types, certain environments that people grow up in that seem to predispose people to eating disorders. I'm thinking things like people-pleasing, perfectionism, growing up in a culture that values thinness, or a family where there's a lot of focus on appearance and weight. There are precipitating factors. That is, a lot of times there's an event that precipitates the eating disordered behavior. And then there are factors that sustain the disordered eating behavior. And I'm thinking things like compliments on weight loss, the feeling of control that sometimes accompanies an eating disorder. So predisposing factors, talked about, the personality traits, family dynamics, culture. Precipitating factor, an event. It can be a transition, like moving. It can be, being teased, or some major stressor. Sometimes you see it, a divorce may trigger it, some type of trauma, in other words. Sustaining or sometimes a precipitating event can be an unexplained weight gain. I knew somebody really well, a man actually, who developed bulimia when he was younger, because he had to go on steroid therapy for kidney disorder, and he gained a ton of weight because of the steroids, and then he got teased and all that. But the weight gain actually precipitated an eating disorder out of desperation to lose the weight. Sustaining factors, the attention for losing weight, feeling of control, like I talked about before. So the etiology or cause of eating disorders, genetics contributes to it. Identical twins, if one twin has an eating disorder, it's more likely that the other twin will, if they're identical twins versus fraternal twins, for both anorexia and bulimia. There seems to be some differences in the brain chemistry, especially when it comes to serotonin in people with eating disorders. The psychosocial component of eating disorders, they call this adult transition disorder, difficulty with the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Changes in the body associated with puberty can be triggering. In fact, that's a prime age for the development of anorexia. And in women, especially at puberty, there's an increase in body fat and a change in the body shape to where they get a thickening. Some of them get a thickening in the middle, that bothers them. So, that body image type thing can be a psychosocial type of thing that contributes. Stressful times of transition, family conflict, ineffective, just an inability to cope with stress or emotions, or some of the psychosocial contributors. The sociocultural pressures are actually really important. In 1978, a woman named Hilda Bruch, she's kind of the mother of eating disorder research. She was the first to say that the media and fashion industry may contribute to the body image disturbance that can lead to eating disorders, lack of self-worth. And it's more prevalent in industrialized countries. I have an interesting study that I'm going to talk about in a second. Another kind of groundbreaking study on body image showed Playboy and centerfolds and Miss America contestants started becoming thinner from 1960 to 1978, while the women's average weight increased. So whenever there's a discrepancy between actual and ideal, you're at risk for body image disturbance. A good friend of mine wrote a book, Anita Johnston, Eating in the Light of the Moon, and she is a psychologist who's an expert in eating disorders. And she competed in the Miss Universe pageant in 1978. And the reason she went into psychology, she was from Guam, actually. The reason she studied psychology and specialized in eating disorders is, she was from a country where eating disorders weren't a thing. But when she was competing, she saw these women, in the Miss Universe or Miss World, I can't remember, with these eating disorders where, they would purge or, restrict their intake and had major body image disturbances. So this is a graph that shows the body weights of Miss Americas and Playboy centerfolds over the time decreasing, while the weight of women increased from about 1960 to the late 80s. So the ideal body, changes over time. I think I remember in the 90s, for women, it was more of an athletic appearance. And in the 60s, 70s, there was a model Twiggy who was very, very thin. So the ideal body type seems to change over the time. And I've seen things change for men as well. I have a picture in a second that I'm going to talk about. So there's a really interesting study that was done with women in Fiji. When TV was introduced into Fiji, and in the South Pacific, they tend to really like a fuller figure with women. That's been the traditional ideal. But when TV was introduced to Fiji, the prevalence of eating disorders really in young girls really increased. Okay, the number of girls dieting increased. The number of girls feeling too big or too fat increased as well. And they think it's the infusion of the Western ideal of the thin body type with the TV shows that contributed to the increase. Eating disorders are increasing among men. I can tell you when I was younger, you didn't see men's abs. If you look at the TV shows from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, men were wearing business suits. You had no idea what they looked like underneath. Then all of a sudden, this obsession with abs started. And so men are experiencing body dissatisfaction in addition to women. So I'm going to stop this clip right there, and then I'll go into, I'll talk about the risk factors for eating disorders now. Activities where weight and shape are emphasized. Gymnasts, a lot of gymnasts have come out as having eating disorders. Dancers, flight attendants. You don't remember this, but in the 80s and I think part of the 90s, flight attendants had to have weigh-ins. There were certain height and weight restrictions for height that they had to meet in order to be a flight attendant. And they said the reason was, they had to fit down the aisle. Well, the weight that they required was actually very, very thin. So anyway, childhood obesity increases the risk, especially if the kid is teased about their weight or bullied about their weight. If there's a family history of psychological disturbance or obesity, that increases the risk. Diabetes increases the risk. There's an interesting phenomenon called diabulimia, where someone with type 1 diabetes will stop taking insulin. And when you stop taking insulin, your body starts to break down. You go into a catabolic state and lose weight. I actually know some, have witnessed some cases of diabulimia, someone who was gaining weight, who had type 1 diabetes, and she just withheld her insulin and lost weight. Very damaging to the body and dangerous. People who are chronically dieting or trying to restrain their eating because there's a natural biological tendency or mechanism, as you know, to prevent starvation. When you restrict, you start thinking about food more, and restriction can backfire and end up with binging, and then you get in this cycle of dieting. Certain personality disorders, a borderline personality disorder, for example, they're at high risk for eating disorders. And then jobs where there's a pressure to be thin or lean. And I'm including dietetics in that because there is a lot of pressure when you're a dietitian to be a certain body shape and weight. If you're in the fitness industry, there's an increased risk. So any job where there's a pressure to be thin or lean. So I'm going to stop this one now, and I'll continue eating disorders in another segment.